Welcome to another broadcast of the Deborah Ruffini Show on the Artist First Radio Network. All past shows are archived. You can find them at artistfirst.com. And now, from England, here she is, your host, Deborah Ruffini.
Greetings from England. I'm Deborah Ruffini with another episode of the Deborah Ruffini Show. Today it is my great pleasure to be speaking with an amazing lady and huge inspiration, Nancy Little, survivor of childhood abuse, now motivational speaker. What a transformation. Upon hearing Nancy's motivational speech, I knew I wanted her as a guest on the show. Nancy, so happy to have you with us. How are you doing?
Thank you.
You doing good?
I'm doing great, thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Now, it was a YouTube clip that I saw of yours, and it really hit me. I found it very emotional, and this subject matter is very close to my heart. And as soon as I saw this, I thought, whoa, this is not the beautiful picture that we get when we think of childhood. And, childhood, we tend to have an image of happiness and playfulness and joy.
Love.
But it wasn't like that for you, was it?
No, it wasn't.
What would you say your earliest childhood memory was?
My earliest childhood memory is I was 3 years old.
Right.
My sister was 10. She was 6.5 years older than I was. And we were fixing to move into a new home.
Right.
And there was some work that needed to be done on the house. And so my sister was at school, and it was my mother, my father, and I, and we'd gone over to the house, and there was no furniture in yet because they were painting the walls.
Right.
And my mom and my dad were in their bedroom painting, and they got in an argument about something, and I was riding my tricycle around in the living room, dining room that was empty at the time, and I heard shouting, and I heard screaming, and I rode my tricycle into their bedroom to see what was going on, see what the problem was, and my dad was screaming at my mother, and he picked up, it was blue paint, and he picked up the large gallon can of paint and hurled it across the room. Oof. And the paint splattered everywhere, and he's screaming and yelling at my mother, and she's cowering in the corner, and I saw the paint going everywhere and the buckets flying everywhere, and I can clearly remember riding my tricycle back into the living room and huddling down in the corner in my mind, thinking that if I hid in the corner, they wouldn't be able to find me.
Right.
And that's my first real clear childhood memory. And we moved in there just shy of my 4th birthday.
Not a good memory. Not a good first memory.
No, it's not.
So I understand your parents were born-again Christian?
Yes, they were. They belonged to a denomination in the U.S. called the Assemblies of God. It's a Pentecostal denomination. And at the time, it was, at least at the churches that we went to, there was a lot of rules. There were a whole lot more rules against doing anything than there was to do anything. We weren't allowed to go to movies. We weren't allowed to wear jeans. We weren't allowed to play cards. Right. We weren't allowed to go dancing, wear makeup, wear dresses above our knee. It was just a whole list of no.
Crumbs. And it makes us feel in turn that God is just this miserable killjoy, doesn't it? That he doesn't allow anything.
We were raised with the belief that God was a very angry, vengeful God, and the least small thing that you could do wrong, he could just strike you dead at any moment. And that's what I was raised with. Until I was 17, we went to a much larger church, and it was at that church in Fort Worth, Texas, that I heard that God was actually a loving God, and he cared about me, loved me, and wanted the best for me. And it was really that church that changed the way I viewed my faith, and it's become a very important thing to me. But unfortunately, you know, there's still a lot of people who are raised in that type of belief system.
Yeah. Yeah, it's scary, and it must have been a sense of relief to hear this completely different God than what you'd been taught to believe in.
Yeah, it was, and ironically, it was that church that my parents tried to get me to not go to.
Oh, that's really...
For various reasons, but I do think a big part of that was they did not believe the way that I was raised, and they wanted to try to keep me, you know, in the mindset that I had been raised in. Because, I mean, when I grew up, I was not allowed to have any friends that was not a part of that denomination. I was not allowed to date any boy that was not in that denomination. And so when I married a guy who was not that denomination, you know, they just didn't know what to do with that.
Oh my goodness, that's very controlling, isn't it? That's kind of religion rather than love.
It's very controlling, and honestly, you know, over the years as I've healed through the abuse that I went through, I've discovered that domestic violence, sexual abuse runs rampant in many of these very strict denominations because they try to be so perfect, and nobody's perfect. And what happens when you're trying to be perfect is things start to crack.
Yeah.
And so domestic violence is high, never talked about. I was taught from the age, you know, before I could even walk and talk, that what happens at home stays at home. And we were not to tell anybody anything that happened. And being the fact that I was sexually abused, that made me feel even more trapped.
Sure. Yeah, control all round. So, I mean, this is very... I kind of feel bad, the fact that we're talking about, sort of asking you things like this, the whole subject matter we're covering here, because I feel so awful for the things you've gone through. I mean, are you comfortable speaking about how that all started and when you were first aware of that?
Absolutely.
Okay, yeah, go ahead.
I was sexually abused by my mother. That is a subject that is taboo even in today's world. That's one reason I've chosen to speak about it, because for years I tried to seek help and could not find any because nobody talks about it.
No.
I mean, even in college, I asked college professors, you know, when we would talk about sexual abuse, I asked one particular one about, well, what about mothers that sexually abuse? And his response was, oh, well, mothers would never do that. So even in the therapy world at that time, in the late 70s, early 80s, no one was speaking about it. And even today, you might get a paragraph, if that, in a book. There are still very few books written on sexual abuse. And what happens is that leaves survivors like myself feeling trapped, alone, feeling that, well, we must be crazy because, you know, in my mind, if something's written about something, then it happened.
Yeah.
And since I couldn't find anything on the subject, it made me feel crazy.
I bet.
It made me feel like, well, what's wrong with me? Because I've got all these memories, and everybody's telling me that mothers don't do that, so what was it that my mother did?
Yeah.
And
That makes sense.
That in itself did tremendous damage to my healing, and it took me a long time before I was finally able to find someone who knew how to deal with that. And it took quite a few years, but I've been able to work through the abuse and change not the thoughts, because the thoughts will always be there, but I've changed how I view that. I don't blame myself anymore.
Good.
A lot of people think, because the first thing you say is, I've been sexually abused by my mother, they assume that you must be gay.
Yeah.
That's not true. Sexual abuse and sexuality are not the same things.
No.
And you don't look at somebody who's been sexually abused by their father and say, oh, you must be straight.
Yeah.
So why would you automatically assume, because your mother was the one who sexually abused you, that you're gay?
Yeah.
But that's what people connect the two, and it's incorrect.
That's crazy, isn't
But
it?
I was sexually abused by my mother from the time I was a baby.
Oh.
My sister remembers coming around the corner when I was little, an infant, still in diapers, and watching my mother do things to me that she didn't understand. All the years growing up, I have memories of my mother coming into our bedroom. My sister and I always shared a bed. My mother had a miscarriage in between me and my sister. That's why there's almost 7 years between us. And so she had given away all the baby furniture. So I slept in just a cradle, a drawer, so to speak, until I was 6 months old. And then I was put in the bed with my sister. And so we shared a real close relationship. We protected each other.
Yeah.
And so we always shared a bed. And my sister remembers her coming in the middle of the night, and we'd both wake up. My mother would be huddled over me with her hands down my pants.
Oh, my goodness.
And she would ask my mom, well, what are you doing to Nancy? And her response was either, oh, I'm straightening the sheets, or I'm putting up the laundry. And then it went to, when those were questioned, well, why didn't you put the laundry up, in the daytime when we're awake?
Yeah.
Then she came up with, well, I'm checking to see if Nancy's hymen is intact. Well, why would you be checking that? I mean, at the time, my sister didn't know what that meant.
No.
But why would you be checking a 3-year-old for that? That doesn't make sense.
No. That is...
And so that happened as long as I can remember growing up. And when I was 16 years old, I started blocking the door, and that got me in trouble. And then when I was in college, I would put locks on the door to keep her out. And I would come home, and she would take the locks off the door, and I would put them back on. I would come back home the next day. She would have it off again. And that just went on consistently until I finally left.
When was that? What age were you?
I was just barely 20 years old, and it had gotten to the point that I was extremely suicidal, and I knew that if I didn't leave, I was going to die. It was one of the two. And in my brain, I had worked too hard to get to college. I had been diagnosed with juvenile rheumatoid arthritis at the age of 3. My parents refused to give me any medical care growing up. And so by the time I was 19, I started having to have my joints replaced. And I'm almost 60 now, and I've now had 72 surgeries because of lack of medical care growing up.
Dreadful.
And so because of that, that kind of changes the way you live. I felt like I fought long and hard to get to college, to make a life separate from my parents, and I knew that if I didn't get out of there alive, then my parents would win, and
Yeah.
I'd worked too hard to allow that. It was my parents, I think, understanding that I was just going to stay there forever. I had overheard my mother at the age of 15 tell my aunt that no one would ever want to marry me and that I would just live there forever. And so I knew if I didn't get out of there that I would end up dead because I was just at the breaking point.
Yeah.
And so I had a supervisor. She was the owner at the preschool that I worked. She actually called me into her office, and long story short, she loaned me the money after she found out what was going on with my mother, and she gave me enough money for the deposits and the last month's rent, and then just took it out of my check a little bit at a time. And so I packed everything I could pack up one day when I knew both my parents would be gone. And I obviously couldn't tell them I was leaving, and so I couldn't pack anything ahead of time because my mother routinely went through my drawers and my closets when I would be gone at college all day. And so when I knew they both would be gone for an hour, I packed everything I could pack up and put it in my car and left and never looked back.
Good for you. Do you think, Nancy, just listening to you speak, I'm just wondering, do you think that was part of the tactic? If she could keep you abused, then it would kind of keep you hers, and you wouldn't be able to venture out into the big wide world and have your own life? Is that a possibility?
Oh, that's absolutely what was going on. My parents paid part of my sister's education, and my sister paid for the rest of it. And then she quit early to get married, and so that was their reasoning why they would not pay for my college education. Anytime I wanted to do something growing up, it was always, you can't do this because of your arthritis. I was rarely allowed to go to parties at church. When the youth group would go do something because of my arthritis. My mother used that all the time and kept me extremely isolated from other kids and church friends. And so when I decided that I definitely wanted to go to college, I knew the only way I was going to go to college is if I worked. So I worked a job at the college, which helped my finances. And I also worked at the preschool 30 hours a week. And I took a full load at college and had 5 surgeries during 4 years of college and still graduated with my class in 1983 with my social work degree.
Wow, that's very applaudable. That's
but
quite
I
something.
knew from the time I was 15 that I wanted to be a social worker. I did not have the words yet really to explain to anybody what was happening with my mother because we were not taught about sex. We were not allowed to talk about sex. We were not even taught the names of our body parts. I learned that through health class in school.
Right.
And so she used the arthritis as a way to keep me at home, to keep me isolated from other kids. My parents did not believe that children were children. They believed that basically we were little adults. Our freedom as far as just going out to play, like most kids did, was very monitored. We were not allowed to play with most of the neighborhood's kids because they weren't the same denomination that we were.
Oh, right.
If we did get to go out and play, it was only because we had finished the litany of chores that my mother would write down each day that we had to do after school or on Saturdays. So if we got to go out and play, it was for 15 or 20 minutes. We were never allowed to just go out and ride our bikes and do what the normal neighborhood kids did.
That's very sad, isn't it? On top of the abuse, you've got this whole stuff of, we're different sort of thing.
We were very different. I was born in 1959, so, when I was a preteen, teenage years, when everybody, was wearing long, straight hair and, bell-bottom pants and mini dresses.
Yeah.
Here, my sister and I were wearing long dresses below our knees.
Yeah.
Our hair had to always be curled, and we weren't allowed to dress like the other kids. So I already looked different because of the RA. From the time I was 4 years old, my knees were so swollen I couldn't put my feet together.
Dear, dear.
And my elbows were swollen, my fingers were swollen. So I looked different than a normal kid. And then having to dress different just made it all the worse.
Sure.
I was bullied and picked on and taunted at school. And even as bad as that was, it was still better than being at home.
So there was no escape. So whether you're at school or whether you were home, there was just no escape.
There was no escape, but
Whew.
but at school, at least I didn't have to worry about what my mother was going to do. And I started first grade at 5 because my birthday is late October, and back then in the early 60s there was not a birthday cutoff like there is now. So I was always a year younger than most of my classmates. And so I was much smaller because of all the abuse that I went through. Part of the abuse was my mother feeding me laxatives, and that kept me much smaller than the average child. At the age of 15, based on the school records that I have, I weighed 50 pounds.
Oh, my goodness.
And I do believe a lot of that has to do with my mother feeding me laxatives growing up.
It's so sad just hearing all this. You think of the word mother. I'm thinking of my mother, and I'm kind of feeling really guilty because she's just absolute love. And I just can't get my head around a mother who, you think of like Mother's Day and you think of roses and you think of, oh, love you, Mum,
Right.
you're wonderful. And I just
That's
can't
what
get...
most people think of, and that's why, for the most part, on my YouTube video, I get the majority comments are positive. Thank you for speaking out. My mother went through this. My aunt went through this. I went through this.
Yeah.
But every now and then I get somebody who's upset that I spoke the truth and just, is irate that I'm talking about it. But if I don't talk about it, how are other survivors going to know that this stuff happens and they don't have to live in silence anymore?
Yeah.
I mean, I grew up that way, and I thought for years that there had to be something wrong with me. And as a child, I would watch other mothers, how they were with their kids, and I would try to mimic what they did to get the same response that they got. And that just never happened. My mother couldn't give me that.
No.
But as a child, you think there's something that you're doing wrong. And in reality, it wasn't anything I was doing wrong. It was my mother. She just could not respond that way.
Yeah, as children, we just assume because if they're grown up, they must be right. Isn't it?
Exactly.
That's
and again, that's where the religion played a huge part in my role, because it was beaten into us that we had to obey our mother and father. It's in the Bible.
Oh, yeah.
That was beaten into us, that you do not question. If mother or dad tells you to do something, you do it without question.
Yeah.
And so when you're 3 or 4, you just assume that this is what all mothers do. And I was in first grade sitting in a reading group, and a little girl next to me asked me to spend the night one Saturday night.
Mm.
And I said, I can't do that because my mother has to do, and I went on to describe some of the things my mother did every Saturday night, which was a ritual.
Mm.
And she just looked horrified, and she said, no, my mother would never do that.
Right.
And it was at that point I knew that what my mother was doing was not done by every mother.
Yeah.
But up until that point, when you're a child, you just think that's what happens in every home.
Yeah, if that's all you know.
You don't question it because you don't know anything different.
Yeah, if that's all you're saying.
That just made me feel even more peculiar, even more different than the other kids. I mean, it was bad enough I didn't look like them. It was bad enough that I couldn't do the activities with them because I wasn't allowed. And then on top of that, my mother was doing things to me that didn't happen to other kids. So in my head, it had to be my fault.
Yeah.
And it took several years of therapy to understand that it wasn't my fault, that this was about my mother's problem.
Mm. Thank God you did. Thank God you did in the end. I mean, how was it reconciled? If you were to have asked her, how would she have reconciled this appalling behaviour with God's love, claiming to represent a loving Heavenly Father?
Well, I mean, my mother had a mental illness, and so that's a hard question to really answer.
Sure.
When I was 19, the second semester of my college, up until Thanksgiving that year, my mother seemed, I mean, she was her usual self, but she began to cry a lot, and her fingers began to swell.
Right.
And she ended up in the hospital a couple of times, and the doctors kept telling my dad, there's nothing physically wrong. I think this is emotional.
Mm.
And my father, of course, did what he did before, which is nothing. And by Christmas, she could no longer sit up by herself. By New Year's, she could not sit up by herself, could not walk by herself, could not even hold a spoon or fork by herself.
Mm.
And so Christmas, New Year's Eve of that year, my father took her to another state in the U.S. and put her in a private psychiatric hospital, and told me that I could not tell anybody where she was at, not anybody from the church, not my boyfriend who I'd dated for a year and a half. I could tell nobody. And so once again, it was all about keeping the secrets in the family.
Sure.
And she was in the hospital for approximately 2.5 months, and my grandfather died, and she told the shrink on call that she would come back after the funeral, and of course I knew she wouldn't. I knew once she left she would not go back, and she didn't. She went up to stay with a brother for 6 weeks or so, who ironically was one of my molesters when I was 9.
Ooh.
And stayed with him for 6 weeks or so, and then came back home, and within a month had gone off all her medication again and went right back to the way she was. Just
dear.
crazy.
That's madness.
And it is madness. The whole thing, to me didn't make sense. And I do think in part of the way I grew up was why it was so important for me to continue to get my degree, even though I was having joint replacement surgeries. It just, all this craziness made it even more important for me, because I had this intense drive inside of me to figure out what made her tick. Why was she doing this?
Yeah.
If she was doing this, then other mothers could be doing this. And that is why I became a social worker, because I felt like that somebody needed to be out there who understood the signs.
Yeah.
Somebody needed to help kids before they became adults and before they committed suicide or before they ended up abusing their own kids.
Oh, good for you.
And so, I've done my best not to let the sexual abuse define who I am, but I don't forget that. To me, that's something that is very hard to forget, but I use that as my motivation.
Yeah.
Because I know, from working with children these past 38 years, that this is still happening. We just had a case in the U.S. this past week where the child ended up supposedly missing, and it turns out that the father had beat the child for soiling his pants to death and then had buried him.
Oh.
Then had come on TV bawling and saying that he was missing when in fact he had beat him to death. These things are still happening, even in 2019. So the only way I know to break this cycle is for people like myself to talk and keep talking until we can make changes.
Oh my goodness, I admire you so much. That is so strong. Because you could have either grown into a bitter, angry person about it, or been the gracious butterfly that you've blossomed into. And I just, I just so admirable.
Oh, thank you.
Wow,
I appreciate that.
No, it's just really incredible. So the relationship between your mother and father was kind of taken out on you and your sis?
I'm sorry, I didn't understand the last part.
Oh, sorry. Was the relationship between your mum and your dad taken out on you and you have a sister, is that right?
Oh, yes. Yes, it was. For the most part, I would say 90%, my sister received the physical abuse.
Right.
By my father in particular, my mother too. My father beat her with the belt all the way up to 2 weeks before she went to college. My mother would hit us with anything that she could find, hairbrushes, rulers. Back when I grew up, the hard wooden rulers with the thin metal rim so that you could draw with. That's what she liked, and those things really cut in your skin when they're used as a disciplinary method.
Yeah.
But she would use hairbrushes, cords, rulers, hands, whatever she could grab. She also knew how to grab you around the arms so that the bruises didn't show. And
that's clever.
I had not really noticed it. My father took pictures all the time. It was important to him to show we were this perfect Christian family. My father was the worship leader and the choir director growing up. My mother taught Sunday school at times. And so it was important for them to show the world what a good Christian home we came from. And so my father took pictures a lot. And it was my therapist who pointed out to me years after all this that I would be sitting in the middle of a Texas summer with sweaters on, or I wasn't dressed appropriately like the other people in the picture. And I do believe now that part of that probably was hiding bruises and things.
Yeah.
Because, I mean, when you grow up in it, you don't question it as much. But you look back and you look at pictures and you think, That's odd. And it was my father, when I talked to him about, why didn't he get me medical care? And he said, well, I just never noticed that there was really anything wrong. And I'm like, you're kidding me. You can look at the pictures from the time I was 4 and see my knees so swollen that I look like a penguin because my feet are sticking, out to the side because my knees are so swollen the feet can't even touch. How can you look at pictures like this day in and day out and not notice that? And not notice that I can't squat or sit like a frog or sit on my knees like other kids.
Yeah.
In the States, I don't know how it is there, but in the States, because my early years, we were in Oklahoma and in Texas. Well, Oklahoma and Texas is what we call Tornado Alley because it's the 2 states that get hit with tornadoes a lot. So we had tornado drills, which is where you have to sit on your knees under your desk.
Right.
Well, I can't sit on my knees because of the RA. And the kids would laugh at me and point at me and make fun of me and call me names because I would be huddled under the desk, but I couldn't squat like the other kids.
Yeah.
And my dad knew this, and so I still have a hard time computing how could he be taking pictures of me for 20 years and not notice. When I was 19 and I was in college, my father had a part-time job at night at a hospital, and it was in the same town as where I was going to college, and it was there that the physician of the college football team noticed me, and he was the one who told my father I needed surgery. And after he was the first doctor who did my first 5 joint replacements, and he told my father that he had never seen a set of knees as bad off as mine were.
Oh my goodness.
My one leg before I had surgery had fused by itself at 30 degrees, and the other one had fused at 15 degrees. And so what that meant was I could barely move my legs as far as bending at the knee.
Yeah.
And when I would go to my car at night after being at college all day, I would have to sit at the side of my seat, and it would take me 15 to 20 minutes before I could bend my knees enough to get in the car to drive.
Oh, my goodness.
How you can see that day after day and not notice that there's something wrong, I just don't understand. It's not like my dad lived afar. Both my parents, were together.
Yeah.
So I just, I don't understand that. But my dad, I used to joke and say my dad lived in the 51st state, which is called denial.
Yeah, I was just going to say denial.
Denial is a big thing. And if you've grown up in a family of abuse, then you're going to understand what I'm talking about, because you will do almost anything to not see that your kids are being hurt. And my father knew from the time I was 4 that I was being sexually abused. Because I was being sexually abused by my mother's best friend, who was a female chiropractor in Oklahoma. And they were abusing me together, and the secretary of this chiropractor had called my father and told him what was going on and told him he needed to put a stop to it. And he never did. He just politely said thank you and hung up, and that was it.
Was that, again, do you think, all part of trying to maintain this image of this perfect, godly family?
This Christian home, and this doctor, Dr. Smiley, which is an ironic name for her, but that was her name, was a great amount of stress in our home.
Right.
When we would go over there during the day when my sister was at school, I can remember as young as 4 being told not to tell Daddy that we went to Dr. Smiley's, because she caused a great deal of fights in our home. My mother hung on every word that this lady spoke. If we did something remotely small, like spilling our milk or knocking orange juice over, like little kids do, she would call Dr. Smiley, and whatever punishment Dr. Smiley felt we needed was what she did. She hung on every last word Dr. Smiley said. And so my father felt that basically their marriage consisted of his wife, Dr. Smiley, and himself.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, you know, there was a lot of fights caused about this triangle. And so when we would go over there, when we would go home, she would rehearse with me where we had been, you know, to the store, to go see somebody else. And she would rehearse it over and over until I had the right story, just in case my dad asked what we had done that day. And if I slipped up, like kids do, and told the truth, which was part of the problem, you know, we're taught in church routinely, tell the truth, don't lie. So if you tell the truth, then you get beat for it in this situation. But then if you don't tell the truth in another situation, you get beat for that. So it was a no-win situation.
Must have felt like a nightmare, just a living nightmare. All
it
round.
Felt like being trapped in a triangle and you're searching for a door and can't find it.
Yeah.
You're just going from corner to corner and there's no way out.
My goodness.
And it was my sister that that really kept me from going crazy.
Yeah.
Because she and I protected each other. In fact, as young as around 3 or 4, we created our own sign language with each other so that we didn't have to speak out loud, because we knew if we said the wrong thing, that would get us in trouble. So we had made up our own sign language. And, I mean, this was before I even knew sign language existed.
Yeah.
It was something that we created ourselves so that we could talk among ourselves without our mother knowing what we were talking about.
Adding more pressure, really, wasn't it?
Yeah, it did. And when she went off to college when I was 10, it devastated me. I cried. We drove her to Missouri from Texas, and I cried all the way up there and all the way back, because I knew at that point my safety, even though she couldn't stop the abuse, I felt safer as long as she was in the room.
Of course.
And when she went to college, then there was no one then.
No.
You know, for me to talk to, no one for me to lean on, and we never really spoke about the abuse, but we both knew it was there.
Yeah.
You know, we would talk about mother coming in at night and things like that. We never really talked about what she was doing, but it was like we had an unspoken understanding that we knew what each of us was going through.
Like the elephant in the
room.
Like
I understood, you know, what she was going through with our dad and him beating her, and she understood what I was going through with my mom.
Yeah.
And then when she went to college, you know, she was several states away, so that protection was no longer there.
Horrific. Do you know, Nancy, I love what you say. The YouTube clip that I watched, your motivational, like an after dinner speech, wasn't it? And you say, you finish by saying, "I'm not just a sexual abuse survivor, I'm a thriver," and that's
Correct.
Really powerful. That is really powerful stuff. Now you're a CASA volunteer, is that right? Talk to us a little bit about you won an award.
I was a CASA volunteer for 10 years, and that stands for Court Appointed Special Advocate.
Okay.
And what that is that we are a voice for the child in the court.
Great.
Most children are too young to be able to be in court and speak up and say, you know, what happened to them, say, what their wishes are as far as where they would like to live, etc. And I've testified in court so many times I can't even count. And what we do and what I did was I worked with the children at their home, whether that was in foster care, it could be maybe they were living with a grandparent, they might be living with a different parent, and generally speaking, it was a parent or someone in the family who had abused them in some way, whether that was physical, sexually, emotional. And I actually had a case towards the end that was very similar to how I grew up. It was a case where a parent had not given them medical care. And so, I mean, I've had everything from sexual abuse to physical abuse to the lack of medical care. And she gave me the case because she knew that I knew a lot about that.
Yeah.
And that is why I've chosen to speak up, because, again, if we can stop this from happening to a child when they're young, then they have a chance to have some happiness growing up. They have a chance to have a childhood, which I didn't ever have. I don't ever remember thinking like a child. I always felt like I was older than what I was. I mean, I started babysitting outside the home at the age of 9, and I just thought that's what all kids did.
Wow.
And, I started that. One, I really, truly enjoyed children, but that was my only ticket to the outside world. It was the only time I was ever allowed to leave the house on my own. And the one thing my father felt very strongly about was a strong work ethic, and that's one thing he gave me, was a strong work ethic.
Yeah. And
that was the one reason I was ever allowed to leave the house during the day or at night was to babysit. And so by the time I was 15, I had every weekend filled up by babysitting.
Oh, dear, oh, dear.
I did not go out on dates because I went on one date with a guy I had a big crush on my junior year of high school, and we went to a bonfire at his church, which was, very basic. She knew where I was going to be. It wasn't a one-on-one date. It was with a group. And my mother called up the boy's mother and threatened to sue them if the boy raped me.
Oh, my goodness.
And the mother was so taken aback that she told her sons that he could not see me again because my mother was crazy as a loon.
Yeah.
And so I learned very quickly that if I was to date, it would have to be after I left home. And I wasn't willing after that point to put any guy through that again. And so rather than dating like most of the kids at the schools that I went to, and I went to at least 14 schools that I know of, and 4 high schools, that I booked every weekend for babysitting.
Yeah.
And it was, I do think in part, a lot of the reason that I did survive and was able to get out is because that enabled me to see that there was life outside of my home.
Yeah.
It was a ticket into TV to realize that through books and television that not everybody lived the way I grew up. And that what was happening at my home wasn't right. It wasn't normal. That's not what all mothers did.
No.
And that's what my mother, from the time I was 10 or 11, I would tell her that this wasn't right. This wasn't normal. And she would scream in my face and tell me that's what all mothers did.
Woo! I don't think I do.
Being able to babysit, being able to see other parents with their children, being able to watch TV shows we weren't allowed to watch at home, that gave me a ticket to see that not everybody's family was like mine.
Yeah, like an outlet. Yeah.
And that's what gave me hope, was that there were homes that weren't like the way we grew up.
Oh, thank goodness you saw that.
All fairness, that's, besides God, that was, and my sister, that was one thing that gave me hope that I could escape and have a better life and have a different life, was that I did not have to grow up and marry and become like my mother.
Yeah. And thank God you didn't. It's so.
And I've worked really hard not to be like her. When I had my daughter 33 years ago, and after 4 miscarriages, I read everything I could read, every book, every magazine about parenting, because I was determined not to raise her like my mother raised us.
Yeah. Oh, well done. Good on you. That is brilliant, because, like I've said, it could have gone one of two ways, and I'm sure you're a super mother, and it's just, I'm extremely proud of you, Nancy, as I'm sure many others are.
Thank you.
And the listeners will be. Indeed, you're a blessing to so many through your support and encouragement, and it's a hard way to get to help others, but I believe God is using you and in the process richly blessing you. Oh, Nancy,
yes, I believe that too.
Oh, you're wonderful. It's been so great to speak with you. This hour has gone so quickly.
I know, too fast.
Yeah. Maybe you can come
If any
back.
of the viewers want to look up my story on YouTube, hopefully they will. I would love to hear from them.
Okay.
And I will also, put this link on my channel so that they can hear it, because I've had several people already ask me if I had any other, anything else out there. So this will give them a little bit more detail than how I grew up than the 14 minutes that I had, to tell my story.
Sure, yeah. And if it's okay with you, if we'll have the that link on the artist page. Artist first. That's the name of my book, Artist Page. The Artist First.
Thank you so much.
On the we'll
and
have
I
that
just
link.
want to give a big shout out to my big sister Jeannie, who is my angel, and I've always called her my angel.
Yay, Jeannie!
Because I don't think without her I would be able to do what I've been able to do. And she went through some of the same abuse with my mother, and went through. It was my sister that had to call the cops. Well, she would call my grandparents, who would then call the cops after my dad had beaten my mother many times.
Dear, oh dear.
And she had a hard job. She didn't have a childhood either. And I just want to send a big shout out about how much I love her.
Oh, so what's her name? Jeannie?
Jeannie, yes.
We love you, Jeannie. I love you, Jeannie. I love your sister as well, Jeannie. She's fab.
Thank you.
It's been so great.
Thank you for giving me the opportunity to speak today.
Oh, the privilege has been all mine. It's a huge honour. Thank you so much. It's been great to speak with you. And, thanks for what you do and for sharing your life story with us. And to the audience, bless you, Nancy, richly, richly. To the audience, thank you for listening. And till next time, much love and God bless.